From the Heritage Foundation, I'm Michelle Cordero, and this is Heritage Explains. By now, most of us know about Seattle's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, also known as CHAZ and CHOP.
In the wake of recent protests against police brutality, a self-styled alternative community has sprung up in Seattle. It happened after police withdrew to the edges of the city's Capitol Hill neighborhood in an attempt to de-escalate tensions with demonstrators. Activists have since occupied and assumed control over a 6-block stretch of land.
Early on, Seattle's mayor, Jenny Durkan, was content in letting the occupation of the property continue, even calling it the Summer of Love.
I know there's an acronym that is now the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I got news for people. It's been autonomous my whole lifetime, and anybody who knows and loves Capitol Hill knows that to be true. I want to make clear that for myself and for the city and for Chief Best, the First Amendment rights of residents must be protected, and protesters must feel safe when they express their First Amendment rights. Over the past few days, we've had peaceful demonstrations across the city. Unfortunately, our president wants to tell a story about domestic terrorists who have a radical agenda and are promoting a conspiracy and fits his law and order initiatives. It's simply not true.
Media outlets on the left painted the Autonomous Zone as a festival. And maybe parts of it did seem that way. I saw some coverage of dancing and even a Ben & Jerry's truck handing out free ice cream. But in the span of 2 weeks, things have dramatically changed. Here's Fox News' Martha McCallum.
Right now, Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan announced a plan to send the police back in to the CHOP protest zone and to reclaim the East Precinct that she made them abandon 2 weeks ago. This after 2 shootings this weekend where one person was killed and another person was critically injured. Watch what she had to say.
I am hopeful and confident that these organizations that we are in dialogue with and others will work to encourage individuals to leave voluntarily.
Mayor Durkan saying one reason for this decision, due to the complaints from residents and businesses in the area, she has taken back her statement about this being a summer of love in Seattle, and now she is going to send the police back into that precinct. That's going to be an interesting situation to watch develop.
This week on Heritage Explains, our guest, Jarrett Stepman, a contributor to the Daily Signal and author of The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past, will help explain how Capitol Hill in Seattle got to this point, if communities like this could ever actually work, and what he thinks will happen next. We'll be right back with our conversation after this short break.
Overwhelmed by the 24/7 news cycle? Looking for a way to keep up with the news that matters? The Daily Signal podcast brings you the top news of the day, plus interviews with lawmakers, authors, Heritage Foundation experts, and more on the most important policy debates in America today. If you're a conservative who wants to be on top of the news, check out the Daily Signal podcast, available every weekday morning.
Okay, so self-styled alternative community, makeshift city, what would you call this?
You know, it's interesting. The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which was the original moniker of this area of Seattle, which comprises about 6 blocks in the middle of downtown Seattle, it's actually changed its name since then. It's called the Capitol Hill Organized Protests. And I would say that I would define it as it is a kind of secession within the middle of the city. Now, of course, there is some element of law enforcement that still occasionally goes in, but for the people inside, they've mostly blocked off these 6 blocks of the city with concrete barriers. They actually have what I consider almost like border control guards standing out front of just people who meander around and say that they're enforcing the border there around CHAZ or CHOP. So it's difficult to actually define CHAZ, other than that it is an autonomous zone within the city. It's a place where you have protesters, which started out as a protest of the Seattle Police East Precinct. that kind of developed into a permanent state of protest where you have people that are coming in and out who are not leaving, who say that they are going to abolish the police and abolish court systems, along with a long set of demands. So it is, to a certain extent, operating independently of the city of Seattle.
Okay, so some of our listeners have reached out and specifically let me know that they listen to us and they're not listening to the news. So I just want to go over again how this started. So the Seattle police, in essence, just vacated their headquarters and gave over that piece of land.
That's right. And that's what's kind of incredible about this whole thing is that it's basically built on where the former police headquarters was. Now, the police, of course, in these precincts are still operating, but mostly outside the zone now. And it was essentially given a license by the mayor, Jenny Durkan, who's essentially accepted the fact that these protesters have decided that they're going to make their protest a permanent part of the city of Seattle. Now, of course, how permanent that's going to be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and more from now, of course, that's yet to be determined. But for now, it's basically set up as a fully autonomous zone within the city of Seattle.
I can't help but wonder how much of this has to do with some of the funky laws that already exist in Seattle. Like my husband was just telling me about this mutual combat law that they have, where people can literally fight each other legally. Like if a fight is about to happen, they can ask the cop who's called, and he kind of plays referee over two people who are going to duke it out, and like that's legal. And I'm sure Seattle has some other funny things. Do you have any thoughts on Seattle's mayor and the way they go about their policies as to why this type of thing happened there?
Well, I mean, Seattle, for most who know, is a very progressive city in this country. I would say it's one of the most progressive cities. In fact, some of these kind of sort of autonomous zones have actually happened a few times in their histories. It happened in the 80s. There were a number of these kind of autonomous collectives that kind of started and stopped within the city. They've had a lot of labor unrest over the past really century. In the early 20th century, there was actually large battles between the so-called Wobblies, who are kind of socialist Marxist groups or really radical labor union groups who fought in battle with police. So there's a long history of, I think, left-wing protests in the city. And of course, the CHAZ or CHOP or the Capitol Hill Autonomous or whatever you want to call it is kind of the latest iteration of that kind of flowed from, of course, the initial George Floyd protests, but now it's really mushroomed into something bigger, at least the way they see it. They think that they're setting up some kind of autonomous community that's somehow going to purge the sins of American life and somehow create some kind of, I mean, the way that many of them speak, some kind of utopia there in the middle of Seattle.
So the people who are there, there are people living there, there's tents. Can you just go and hang out?
You can't actually walk in there. Of course, as I said, they have a sort of border enforcement, although they're mostly letting regular citizens walk in and out. There's still businesses more or less operating inside. They're not too keen on letting in any kind of civil personnel. Obviously, police has been a huge issue. There have been huge issues primarily with bringing in ambulances and medical services and the police to deal with some of the issues that they've had inside. They've had a variety of assaults. There was an attempted arson that took place over Father's Day weekend. There were actually several shootings, one in which the police, and there's plenty of body cam footage showing that the police were actually stopped up from going to the shooting. And the result of it was one man died in the shooting because the police were really unable to get to the scene quickly because they were surrounded by protesters who were yelling at them, screaming at them, preventing them from moving. And unfortunately, it led to tragedy. So if you are a regular citizen, you might be able to walk inside and walk around, but you go in there knowing that if there is trouble and if you do get into some kind of physical altercation or somebody attacks you, there may not be a police officer ready to come and help you right away.
Are there small businesses still operating there?
There are small businesses still operating there. Of course, you can only imagine what many of them are dealing with, given that so many have already been under lockdown for so long because of the shutdowns over the coronavirus, opening up to essentially their streets in anarchy. Now, given some of the protesters go to these shops, but at the same time, they have no guarantee of the protection of private property, of a protection of their rights of private property there. And there have been vandalizations. There has been some looting that's gone on inside. And of course, if you have to imagine, if you are somebody who either owns a business there or wants to start a business there, that's hardly an inducement for the future. And there's hardly they would think that, that the local authorities are going to protect them going in the future when something like this is allowed to continue carrying on for as long as it has.
Okay, so NBC has reported that people are actually bringing their children there as a part of a civics lesson on how democracy works. As a parent, I'm not really sure how I feel about that, but because it's interesting to understand how this is possible, can you give us a little bit of a civics history lesson and explain to me and to those who might not understand why or if they are actually allowed to do this?
Well, if you are a parent bringing yourself in, again, there are parts of this protest that has been organized there that is peaceful, but you're taking a chance because you don't have that guarantee to protection of life and property. It's interesting that they say this is a civics lesson in democracy, but if you understand about the worst excesses of democracy and how our free system of government was created that includes elements of democracy, but is not a pure democracy, that is essential for a free system of government to have those guarantees of protection from the authorities of life and property, and have a system, both a system of, in this case, police, and a court system that can allow for, if there are cases in which your life and property are violated, you have a legal process with which to get justice. But one of the demands of these protesters is to abolish courts. How is one to get justice in a system like that without any courts? And of course, ultimately, the appeal ends up with whoever's strongest. And I think we've seen that as different activists and individuals within the zone. One has self-described himself as the warlord of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And frankly, if you are threatened, you have very little to appeal to. I mean, that's not a system of free government, of the rule of law, and that's not how you create a real liberty. Yes, you're free from all the bounds and restrictions of civilized life, but you don't have those protections to go along with them. That's why the United States is such a prosperous and successful society, because it combines those things. You have a free system of government where the people rule, but you also have those protections of a court system. You'll have a police that can show up when you are being attacked or when there is a conflict to resolve. We have a voting process, a regularized voting process, which they also don't have in this zone. It really resembles more of a disorganized mob than what you think is ordered liberty, which I think is ultimately what the best systems have been built on.
So it's not legal, and essentially, I guess to try and explain what they're doing is they're holding the land, and essentially the small businesses there are being held hostage.
They are. I mean, there's really no, and there's also residential areas in there too. I mean, that's the thing, is that they don't really have a choice, and the mayor has called this. She even used the phrase "the summer of love" there in Seattle, which she's walked back a little bit, especially after the violence that has taken place in this zone. She's had to walk that back a little bit because it seems very Pollyannish. I mean, when you have a system, yes, a lot of the people in there are not doing anything violent. They are just, kind of at like an almost street festival. But there is an anarchic element there, and a very dangerous one, especially, if you are vulnerable. And I think that's what makes this thing a very bad situation, and why it's so reckless for local authorities to continue and just watch as this thing unfolds. Is yes, things may start out peacefully, but what are they going to be like week after week as this thing goes along? And how are they going to reassert the authority of the city? What is that going to look like after this has been going on for so long? I don't know. And I'm afraid it's going to be quite ugly.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know the mayor has been communicating with the leader of this movement and the business owners. And it's interesting to me, like you said, like what she thinks is actually going to happen next. And especially because we're hearing that they want to decolonize. They have a spot called the Decolonization Conversation Cafe. I mean, what do they really want then? They want this spot forever and like to just separate from the United States?
They do, and they've created some things that I think, may seem perplexing. I mean, they've created, really even segregated zones within this community where if you can only go into if you're black, and others are for the white citizens there. It sounds an awful lot to me like segregation, which of course is illegal in this country. They've set up these kind of systems where they've kind of created this weird social hierarchy of those who have been oppressed at the top, and those who are the oppressors at the bottom must ask for atonement. Again, none of this, is based on any kind of legal system. There's no regularized laws. There's no real voting except for people shouting in the streets. So this is just kind of an anarchic commune where, there are people of a variety of motivations who have joined this thing. I'm sure some just see this as a fun way to spend the summer, and others have, other very different motivations. So frankly, it's incredible to see this develop right smack in the middle of an American city. This is not just some commune in a rural part of the country where they're kind of separate from society. This is right in the middle of a downtown part of one of America's biggest cities.
In conclusion to our conversation, theoretically and historically, could this work out for them?
Well, I can't say I have much faith. I think a lot of it's based on a total misunderstanding of human nature. I think that the differences between what they're creating in this autonomous zone and America's constitutional system are vast. And I think that because nature abhors a vacuum, in something like this autonomous zone where there really is no rule of law, that's filled with often nefarious characters. People will grab on to those who are strong. Our system is meant to protect the weak from the strong so that we're better as a whole. This system is one of anarchy, in which anarchy and tyranny often go together hand in hand. It begins with anarchy and ends in tyranny. And either the zone is going to disperse because people get bored or they lose interest, or it's going to end up in something much uglier. It's going to end up in maybe confrontations with local authorities. It's going to end up with even higher rates of murders and violence and looting and robberies. It's hard to say what the final result is, but it's certainly, I don't think, going to be this incredible utopia where there's no more prejudice, where there are no more crimes, there's no more violence, when there are no more of these things that they say they want to do away with. I think there's very little chance that that's ever going to happen, something like what they've created.
Thank you so much for your time and your commentary and reporting on this, Jarrett.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps up another episode of Heritage Explains. I'll link to Jarrett's op-ed on this issue and his book in our show notes. Also, did you know that you can choose a topic for one of our experts to explain on an episode? Just leave us a rating and comment with what topic you want to hear about on Apple Podcasts by July 4th, and we'll pick one. As always, I hope you are all well. It's a crazy world out there right now. I'm really looking forward to the 4th of July holiday so we can all share the love we have for this country despite these difficult times. Tim's up next week. We'll see you then.
Heritage Explains is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. It is produced by Michelle Cordero and Tim Desher, with editing by John Popp.